All right, listen, you ever have one of those moments where you stop and go, holy shit, we're actually living through history right now? That's what this is, man. This isn't just some fight night breakdown or another title defense. This is the UFC stepping into a place nobody ever thought it would go. And I'm telling you, this isn't about politics. This isn't about agendas. This is about a sport that started in the shadows, that people used to call barbaric, now standing at the absolute highest stage of recognition you could imagine. And when you think about that, when you realize where it started and where it is now, it makes you want to sit up and pay attention. Because what we're about to dive into isn't just about fighters, it's about culture, it's about evolution, it's about human beings who push so hard, sacrifice so much, and refuse to quit until the world had no choice but to respect what they built. And that's why you've got to stick around, because by the time we're done here, you're going to see this moment for what it really is, a once-in-a-lifetime story of grit, growth, and legacy, the kind of thing people will be talking about for decades. Man, think about how insane this is. The UFC actually doing an event at the White House, that's historic on a level that's hard to even process, because you got to remember where the sport came from. It wasn't that long ago that people were calling it human cockfighting. Politicians wanted it banned. States didn't even want to sanction it. And now we're talking about a full-blown UFC card on the lawn of the White House. Like, that's a first ever moment in sports history, not just MMA history. It's a symbol of how far this thing has come, because you don't just put any event there. That's reserved for stuff that's meant to stand the test of time. And when you think about it, that's the ultimate recognition of MMA as a legitimate global sport, like the government saying this belongs on the biggest stage possible. And it's not just about the fights, it's about the message. It's about the sport that started underground, bloody and raw, and has now risen to the highest level of acceptance. And you know it's going to feel surreal for the fighters too. Like, imagine walking out, not into some arena with screaming fans, but onto the White House grounds with history staring at you. That's a whole different kind of pressure. And it makes you realize you're witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime crossover moment where sports, politics, and culture all collide, because this is more than just a main card. It's a statement that MMA has become part of the American story, woven right into the fabric of history. And years from now, people are going to look back and say, remember when the UFC put gloves on at the White House? That was the moment the sport proved it wasn't just fighting in a cage anymore. It was art. It was entertainment. It was history in motion. And that's what makes this first ever so damn special. When you look at this whole thing, UFC at the White House, what it really screams is growth. Like insane, mind-blowing growth, because this sport didn't start polished with billion-dollar TV deals and world-class arenas. It started in grimy gyms, small promotions, pay-per-views people had to sneak to watch, and back then, nobody thought it would survive. People literally laughed at it, said it was too violent, too barbaric, and now fast forward a couple decades, and it's standing shoulder to shoulder with the NFL, the NBA, all the biggest sports in the world, and the White House event is the ultimate stamp on that. It's like the sport saying, look how far we've come, from outlaws to ambassadors, from being banned in multiple states to being celebrated at the most powerful address in America. And when you really think about that arc, it's nuts. It shows what happens when something raw and real refuses to die, when it pushes through all the criticism and evolves into something unstoppable. And that's what MMA has always been about: evolution, growth, turning adversity into strength. And now you see fighters who are household names, sponsors lining up, media covering every angle, and then boom, the White House. That's not just another venue. That's a symbol. That's validation on a global scale that the UFC isn't just a sport anymore. It's a cultural force. And for the fighters, for the fans who were there from day one, this moment has to feel like vindication, like proof that all those years of blood, sweat, and chaos mattered, that they built something that's bigger than themselves. And now it's literally knocking on the doors of history, because when you host cage fights on the White House lawn, you're not just showing growth, you're proving that the climb from the underground to the highest stage in the world is complete. And that's the wildest part, because if it can grow this much in just a few decades, you can only imagine where it's going next. What blows my mind about this whole UFC at the White House thing is that it instantly changes the way you look at the fighters stepping in there, because it's no longer just about two people testing their skills in the octagon. It's about fighters representing way more than themselves. Like suddenly they're carrying flags, cultures, entire communities on their backs. And the symbolism of doing that on the grounds of the most powerful political building in the world just amplifies it to another level, because now when a guy walks out, it's not just his walkout song, his team, his coaches, it's millions of people watching from his country, his hometown. Even people who've never cared about MMA before suddenly tuned in because that's their guy. That's their representative standing on that stage. And there's something primal and beautiful about that. It's like the modern version of warriors going into battle, not just for glory, but for pride, for respect, and for recognition. And imagine what that feels like for the fighters themselves, because yeah, they always fight for their legacy, for their records, for their families, but now it's magnified. It's like fighting under the eyes of history, under the roof where presidents and world leaders make decisions, and that gives every punch, every kick, every submission attempt this extra weight. Like it's echoing louder than it would anywhere else. And what's crazy is that's exactly what makes this sport so powerful. It's never just about violence. It's about human beings turning themselves into symbols of struggle and triumph. And on that stage, under that spotlight, those fighters become ambassadors of what MMA really is: discipline, heart, resilience. And when they raise their hands in victory, or even when they lose with dignity, it's a message that transcends the cage. It says, look, this is who we are. This is what we represent. And doing that at the White House, man, that's history breathing through every moment. That's fighters becoming more than fighters, becoming voices for everyone who believes in them. The cultural and political impact of something like the UFC making its way to the White House is just wild when you really think about it, because this isn't just a sport being recognized. This is a full-on cultural shift. It's the mainstream finally admitting that MMA isn't just cage fighting. It's a global phenomenon with real influence. And when it steps into the most political address in the world, it's not just entertainment anymore. It becomes a symbol of unity, diplomacy, even soft power, because fighters from Brazil, Russia, Nigeria, Ireland, America, all coming together under one roof. That's bigger than politics. That's showing people that through combat, through struggle, there's this weird universal language of respect that cuts through borders and differences. And politically, it's a statement too, because for decades, combat sports were dismissed as brutal, outlawed in some places. And now you've got the government embracing it, saying, look, this is part of our culture now. This is part of our identity. And that tells you how powerful MMA has become in shaping narratives and influencing generations. And it doesn't just affect fans, it affects perception at the highest levels. Because when world leaders see the UFC being showcased at the White House, they're seeing an industry that's not just about fighting, but about values like discipline, courage, perseverance. And that starts conversations, that builds bridges. And on the cultural side, it's even crazier, because the UFC has always been this melting pot of martial arts, styles, backgrounds. And now by entering this political stage, it cements itself as part of history, part of the story of how sports evolved from the underground into institutions that define eras. So the impact isn't just today's headlines, it's the legacy it leaves for generations to look back on and say, damn, that really changed how the world saw MMA. What's so insane about this whole UFC at the White House moment is that you're looking at something that's not just big for the sport right now, but something that's going to be remembered as a once-in-a-lifetime legacy. Because think about it, there are fights that define eras, champions that become icons, rivalries that people talk about for decades. But this is on another level. This is the sport itself breaking through every barrier it's ever had and planting its flag in history. Because you can always have another title fight, you can always have another superstar rise up, but you're never going to have the first time the UFC was recognized on the world's most political stage ever again. That's cemented forever. That's etched into the story of how far MMA has come. And what makes it so powerful is that for the fighters, the fans, the promoters, everyone who's been part of this journey, it's a moment of validation. Like the crazy dream of turning two guys fighting in a cage into this billion-dollar industry that commands respect on the global scale actually came true. And the legacy of that isn't just about who won or lost that night. It's about creating a moment so monumental that it shifts the way future generations look at the sport. It becomes one of those where were you when it happened kind of things. And for the fighters who stood there, for the people who watched it, they'll carry that with them forever, because that's not just MMA history. That's cultural history. That's sports history. And it's untouchable. You can't replicate it. You can't top the first time. And that's exactly what makes it a legacy that will live on way beyond the fighters, way beyond the organization. It becomes a piece of the story of our time. Man, when you really step back and look at all this, it's just surreal, because what started as this wild idea of two guys stepping into a cage to test themselves has turned into this global phenomenon that's now standing in the halls of the White House. And that's not just sports. That's not just fighting. That's culture. That's history being written right in front of us. And the crazy part is we all get to witness it. We all get to live through this chapter and say, we saw it happen. And I think the big takeaway here is that it proves how far passion, discipline, and resilience can take you, because MMA wasn't supposed to survive. It wasn't supposed to be respected, but it forced its way into the mainstream and earned its spot on the biggest stage possible. And that's a message bigger than fighting. That's about life, about taking something the world doubts and pushing it until it's undeniable. So whether you're a fan, a fighter, or just somebody grinding through your own battles, let this moment remind you that greatness isn't built overnight. It's built by being relentless. And if the UFC can go from underground shows to the White House, then imagine what you can do if you stay fearless and consistent. So good luck to everyone chasing their own path. Thank you for sticking with this ride. And seriously, I appreciate you guys. Keep pushing, keep believing, and let's see where this crazy journey takes us next.